The first thing every would-be dictator does is to invoke a terrifying internal and external threat. And very often this threat can be real, and they'll hype it or use it manipulatively. The second thing a would-be despot always does is to create a secret prison system where torture takes place that is outside the rule of law. And very often, they will also establish military tribunals that strip prisoners of due process. And so what happens when you have a military tribunal system and a secret prison system outside the rule of law where torture takes place is that it starts to put pressure on the rest of civil society. So we should worry about the fact that the state has essentially legalized torture of these marginal people, people who are marginal to us, because what always happens in a fascist shift is that the state will start by abusing people that no one in the mainstream really identifies with much. And then what always happens is there's a blurring of the line, and the noose starts to catch up more and more members of civil society, mainstream society, and it's always the same cast of characters. Us, basically. Journalists, editors, opposition leaders, labor leaders, and outspoken clergy. So why is this so urgently relevant to us? Most Americans don't realize that the president now claims the power to say to any one of us, you're an enemy combatant. If he, on his say-so alone, he can name you or me an enemy combatant, and they can't torture us yet, but they can take us to a Navy brig to a 10 by 12-foot cell and keep us in American citizens, innocent American citizens, in solitary confinement for up to 3 years. So we're at this kind of incredibly fragile moment because democracies don't close down like that in a kind of steady progressive line. They close down more in what Malcolm Gladwell would call a series of tipping points. And so, and then there reaches a point at which democracy can no longer heal democracy. But that point comes really fast when it comes. So the first time that the state made it legal to torture people, that was one of those vertical lines. And for me, you know, everyone in a closing society has their own boundary at which point they start to shut up. So I'm still talking to you in public, in this public place, and you're still here. For me personally, the day I open the New York Times and read that someone I identify with, an editor, a journalist, has been named an enemy combatant and is in solitary confinement, that's the day I'm not going to be talking to you anymore. Because at that point, I will be too scared. So that's how society closes down. And when these tipping points start to come thick and fast, it happens really quickly. The third thing that always happens when would-be despots are seeking to close an open society is that they create a paramilitary force. Now, you know, really think about it. You can't close down a democracy without a paramilitary force. You can't, because people are like, you know, I'm not going to be pushed around by you. But once you have a paramilitary force, you can send that paramilitary force to intimidate civilians. And then it doesn't matter if you've still got the, you know, essential institutions of civil society functioning, because people are really just too intimidated to push back. The fourth thing, and then I'll just zip ahead because these are, you know, hard to absorb. The fourth thing that a would-be dictator always does is to create a surveillance apparatus aimed at ordinary citizens. Now, you know, it doesn't take much for this kind of surveillance apparatus to be effective. In East Germany, everyone thought they had a Stasi file, but only 10% of the people actually did turn out to have a Stasi file. You don't need to surveil everyone in order, if everyone thinks they're being surveilled, that's inhibiting. Why is this so like personally freaking out to me, this surveillance. And by the way, this is driven by a profit motive. You know, America isn't driven by ideologies the way that Italy or Germany were. But America is driven by profit very often. And it's quite extraordinary. When the Berlin Wall fell, the third of the US economy that is defense manufacturing was facing a declining market share because we lost our global enemy. And what do you have to do if you're losing a global enemy and you're the defense industry? Make a new enemy, exactly. They were looking at a real economic catastrophe unless they could hype a new enemy, enter the global war on terror. And what happened was that these weapons manufacturers who used to make Cold War weapons shifted their manufacturing to what's called the security industrial complex technologies, surveillance and security. And they have lobbyists, and their lobbyists work closely with Homeland Security. And it's this, again, multi-billion-dollar industry. And so the best way to make sure that you're going to have continued profits is not just to hype a relatively minor enemy, serious but minor. The way you make sure to generate profit is to be sure that the enemy you create is us, that we are the enemy in need of surveillance. So why is this so personal for me? For a year and a half, every time I got on a plane, I would get a quadruple S, high risk, security threat symbol on my boarding pass. But I was always taken aside and given extra searching, and I kept asking, why are you doing this? Why? Finally, a nice young woman from the TSA said, "You're on the list." And I'm like, "The list? I'm on the list?" And her supervisor sort of hustled her away. And I did some research, I reported it out, and I was in very good company. Richard Murphy, the nation's foremost constitutional scholar, who had just given a speech, he's a Princeton scholar, critical of Bush's assault on the Constitution, was on the list. Two nice little old ladies from San Francisco who run an anti-war newsletter called War Times are on the list. I just heard that one of the leaders of Code Pink, the anti-war group, was turned back from Canada. She was not allowed to cross the border, which is a classic fascist tactic of closing borders to critics and dissidents. She's on the list. Two staffers at the ACLU are on the list. One of the leaders of Greenpeace is on the list. I get these emails I can't bear to open. A decorated war hero started crying when I spoke to him 2 days ago when I was in Denver, because he'd flown all these combat missions. He was so brave, but he broke down when he was describing how not only is he on the list for having criticized the administration, his family's on the list. His 15-year-old child is on the list. So this is very bad because, if you follow the Washington Post, you see that the level of surveillance that is now directed at us is at such a high level that when you get on a plane, they know what you're reading, who you're sitting next to, where you're going when you get off the plane, and what the phone number is of the person you're going to visit. It's gotten to the point where before I got into the line for security at LaGuardia, I realized I was carrying a copy of Tara McKelvey's book Monstering, which is about CIA interrogations, and some of it is classified information, as all good reporting is based on classified information. And I threw it away, a $30 hardcover. I put it in the garbage because, I was too scared to go through security with it. So it's very, very bad when there's a security apparatus aimed at ordinary citizens, because you start by getting on the no-fly list or the watch list, but there are lists, and this is a classic fascist thing to do. They did it in Italy, they did it in Germany. You get on the list, and pretty soon welfare benefits, job opportunities close down if you're on the list. And other unpleasant things happen. When I got to Vermont, where I was copy editing this book, I had my computer inside my suitcase, and I got to my hotel room, and I unzipped my suitcase, and on top of my computer was a letter from Homeland Security in my suitcase. So it's not good. The fifth thing you do in closing down an open society is arbitrarily detain and release citizens. You infiltrate citizens' groups. The ACLU has many lawsuits against the infiltration of ordinary groups here in Seattle. I'm sure anti-war groups, environmental groups, total non-terrorist groups, are, if it's typical of the rest of the country, being infiltrated by police or intelligence agents who dress like you or me. In fact, they're probably possibly here tonight. And you infiltrate citizens' groups, and that's an important piece in breaking down democracy, because then citizens don't have the trust level of working effectively together. You target key individuals. I mean, there's some amazing examples of this. And again, I keep getting emails every day. This is, again, a Goebbels tactic, that you target key individuals, people in the press, academics, people in the media, performers, so, the Dixie Chicks, so that people see that you crash and burn, or there are repercussions if you stand up. You restrict the press. What happens in a closing society is there starts to be a drumbeat of words like terrorist, enemy of the people, sabotage, espionage, treason. And the definition of terrorist or traitor or spy starts to expand and expand, entangling more and more people, more and more criminalization of speech. So, for instance, the blueprint is so predictive. Because of what I know about the blueprint, I could tell when a law was passed last fall expanding the definition of terrorist to include animal rights activists. I knew that within about 6 months, people who looked like the boy or girl next door would be called terrorists and prosecuted. And that's exactly what happened by about March, about 6 months later. By the same token, we were talking about the blurring of the line and how predictive it is. You know from history that the first people to be tried under the Military Commissions Act are likely to be white and English-speaking. And in fact, David Hicks, a white English-speaking prisoner, was among the first to be tried by the military commissions. It's so predictive that the tasering of this kid happened right, according to the clock. So, there's this drumbeat, espionage. There was this drumbeat to charge people who released or revealed classified information with the 1917 Espionage Act. And, and there are other examples of horrible things happening to journalists. Greg Palast, who wrote Armed Madhouse, was investigated by Homeland Security. And staffers for Associated Press and CBS have actually been seized in Iraq because the U.S. didn't like the images and stories they were producing. And, they were held without charges in abusive U.S.-held prisons. So it's very bad. And the last thing that happens is that you subvert the rule of law, or simply declare martial law. And in the run-up to the election, according to the historical blueprint, the months before an election are a very unstable time, most likely to see acts of provocation, hyped threats, destabilizing scenes where there'll be a protest and agents provocateurs will provoke violence or engage in violence to give an excuse for a crackdown. And we have this wrong notion of what a closed society looks like. A closed society doesn't look like marching, goose-stepping columns or crematoria in the distance. It almost never looks like that. Once in history it looked like that. A closed society, even a violent military dictatorship, really has a lot of the trappings of civil society. There are still elections. They're just corrupted. There's a changing of the guard. But it's the same cabal in power, essentially. There's still a judiciary in a closed society. They're just not free to adjudicate freely and go against the regime. There's still academics. They're just watching what they say. There's still newspapers. You just know exactly how far to push an inquiry. I mean, this is a really important moment because the window is closing. But history shows that at a moment like this, if millions of people wake up in time and push back, they can push democracy forward and unseat tyrants. And there are amazing, inspirational stories that are evidence of this in the democracy movements that brought down the Berlin Wall, people power in the Philippines. All over the world, when millions of people push back, they can unseat tyrants. But it takes a democracy movement right now. We have no time to waste. It takes millions of people rising up and insisting on restoring the rule of law. Now, when I first started talking about these issues, I thought we could do it legislatively alone. But this is not enough, I now realize. the violence is escalating. You know, the thing about a fascist shift is that when people start to wake up, that's when they start to crack down harder. And now, at this point, I am persuaded by the historical record that a national uprising to restore democracy is incredibly urgent. The founders did not intend for us to delegate the defense of liberty to a professional class of pundits or politicians or constitutional scholars. That's right. That's right. The founders intended for us to do it. Now, their vision wasn't wide enough yet to include all of us, but the kernel of their vision was sound enough so that it could include women and African Americans, people of all colors, as time went on. But we have to believe in our power in order to do that. The time to stand up for it is now.